The First Blacks of Canada Part 2. After daring to deep dive into the discovery of the Indigenous heritage of Canada's first recorded slave, Mr. Olivier Le Jeune, it's time we take our collective heads out of the dirty gutter business of slavery to explore the identity of Canada's first and most celebrated stamp honouree, the multi-talented, multilingual, multinational, Mathieu Da Costa. This man was everything to everybody and could do it all. We are taught that Mathieu was a transcontinental linguist hailing from Benin or maybe the Congo. It really doesn't matter when you're trying to push the racist exotification of Indigenous nations, just so long as you're sure he's from somewhere in Africa. Mathieu was well known to be a stellar-navigator, negotiator, and the man of 1,000 tongues. Simply put, Superman ain't got nothing on your boy, and if he had, your boy'd be able to talk his way out of it. However, since the lore is both embellished and extensive on DeCosta, let's consult the Canadian Encyclopedia for the official case of this legendary character. What's in a name? In the preamble of the Canadian Encyclopedia entry on Mathieu Da Costa, we are given 4 separate renditions of DeCosta's name, 2 Portuguese, a French, and a Dutch version. All throughout the entry, his name reads DeCosta, spelled exclusively the Portuguese way. This Portuguese spelling is also the primary way his name is found in most sources. If using the traditional Portuguese spelling doesn't ring odd to you, it should, as Canada has 2 official languages and neither of them is Portuguese. The Canadian government sources prefer Da Costa spelled in the Portuguese spelling, rather than their own traditional French or English spelling, as one would expect from the Anglo-Franco imperial dominion of Canada. Why? Why should they prefer this spelling to either of the 2 official languages of Canada? Were the baseless claims of Da Costa's supposed birth continent true, we would expect the man to record an African name, wouldn't we? We'd have some reference to an African state, but instead we only have just as many references to Asia, Australia, and Antarctica as we do to Africa, which of course is none. In fact, the only way we know that Mathieu was richly melaninated is because of the title given to him by pursuing Dutch kidnappers toward the end of his life, where he was described as een swart genaamd Mathieu, which translates directly into a black named Matthew. We should take notice of the use of the article a, rather than the more common use of the term the, which denotes a singular Matthew. It'll be important for later. So what's in a name? Today, typically not much, but historically, there was a lot, and people, especially during this time of fluctuating identities, were often taking on descriptions and labels as names in new social environments. Mathieu Da Costa, or Mathieu the Coast, as it translates, appears to be one such person with one of these shifting identities. Hiring an interpreter. So imagine you are a merchant poised to make your second contact with a vast and legendary country to the west called Tamari. It has been some 80 years since the disastrous first attempts failed, but 3 years earlier you had made an amazingly good first contact, renewal after 80 years of silence. Now your mission has changed from surveillance and peace to mercantile plunder and conscionable exploitation. What is conscionable exploitation, you ask? Well, it means instead of outright theft, mass murder, and plunder, there is a thin veneer dedicated to ensuring that the exploited agree to their exploitation in some baseless form. It's kind of like in those old movies where vampires had to trick you into being invited in. The same rule applied to the early reconnaissance agents. Traditionally, the perfect candidates for this type of work were disaffected, disillusioned dissidents, like traitors to their nation. Others, in Pierre Dubois de Mon's situation throughout all of history, had hired these types or otherwise threatened or coerced natives familiar with local custom, tradition, and language to help them seamlessly slither throughout society. However, according to the conventional account, that is not what happened with our boy Dubois. He was a maverick. He took this winning strategy and threw it right out the porthole. According to the official story, not only did Dubois not hire an Innu nor Lung to translate, not only was the man he hired not one of the countless Algonquin virtually spilling off the continent, but out of the 4 nearest continents to Lnug, the official story places Da Costa as a native of the furthest continent from Lnug. African assumptions, so what evidence exists for Mathieu Da Costa being from Africa? None, I mean it, absolutely nothing, nada, niente, or in the tongue most familiar to Mathieu, mohagagohi. There is absolutely no evidence of an African origin for Mathieu Da Costa, just an overwhelmingly arrogant and racist assumption based on him having the most prevalent pigmentation persuasion on Earth. A complexion even more pervasive some 500 years ago during the life of Da Costa. There is no contemporary literature where he's identified as an African, or even alludes to an African nation. He is never caught whispering words in an African tongue, no flags adorned, no traditional religion practiced, nor identifying traditional markings. Just the retroactive assumptions of arrogant, ill-informed Afrocentrists, whom believe black belongs exclusively to Africa, rather than it being the innate hue of humanity. The word melanin actually comes to us from the Southeast Asian Melanesians. They touch the dark-complected Australian Aborigines in their south, and the outcast Dalit Dravidians, admonished for their midnight hue to their north. Moving west to the middle of Mesopotamia, we find the ever-present Zanj, among other sun-soakers, no less dusky than the Indigenous of Sicily. This trend doesn't end in their old world either. Rather, it continues in our one. All you have to do is ask where are the swarthy worn Warwero, the obsidian-embossed Olmec, or the original American Accomac, to see that the color of humanity's continents is decisively genetically dominant. Indeed, if we are to be honest in our search for Matthew's origins, we need to fairly look at all options and reasonably deduce based on the evidence, rather than self-serving assumptions. Science is unanimous on the fact that all continents started off heavily melaninated, and that adaptation took thousands of years before consistent alteration, which was never 100%. There exists no reason nor evidence that points to, alludes, or even suggests that Mathieu Da Costa is African. There is only the racist assumption of the African monopoly of blackness, which is ignorant at best, and a willful attempt to incarcerate blackness within the so-called dark continent at worst. Blackness remains a global phenomenon since the conception of humanity, and Mathieu is proof of that fact. Evidence? All right. Well then, what do we know about Mathieu Da Costa? 1. We know that he was a celestial navigator, using the stars to navigate, as was customary for all Algonquin coming of age into manhood in his time. 2. We know he was hired to negotiate with Algonquin people, specifically the Mi'kmaq. 3. We know he came to learn both Portuguese and French, but was claimed by neither state, and that Mathieu was hired to translate Algonquin into French. 4. We know that despite the influence of the English and French, in what has become known as Canada, neither ethnic group denied Mathieu's association with the Portuguese. 5. We know that the Basque who had largely fled to Portugal shared a language with the Algonquin, and that Tadoussac was a mutual trade port for the Algonquin and Basque prior to any involvement with the French. 6. We know that Mathieu spoke at least one of the Algonquin dialects, which at the time did not constitute different languages, but rather served only as distinct accents throughout the large Algonquin country. 7. In the Canadian Encyclopedia, the authors attempt to decide the glaring point of historical conflict. You see, while it was common for people's birthdays to not have been recorded in those days, once they reached a certain level of social reputation, it tended to be unavoidable. Mathieu is unique not in the fact that we don't know his birthday, but in the fact that we know two wildly separate times of death in two very distant places. The historic record both states that Mathieu was recorded as returning to Lnumtig with Samuel de Champlain in 1604, and that Mathieu was recorded as having died in Port Royal on the Lnug.ca Peninsula, also known as the Nova Scotian Peninsula, of scurvy during the winter of 1607. While Da Costa was also recorded as being in Holland in Central Europe in February of that same year, and having died sometime after 1619. The historical record eventually finds clearly these two historically verifiable facts could not possibly both be true about one man, so the writers decided to accept one historical account and disregard the other. It is a grave mistake that they made, assuming that one account was wrong and that the other is right, as we shall soon see, instead of accepting the historical record as it is presented, which suggests that there were two Mathieu Da Costas. The evidence for two Mathieu Da Costas, though often circumstantial, the evidence for the two Mathieu Da Costas is substantial. To begin with, Samuel's first voyage was financed by Amar de Chast, a wealthy, retired Basque admiral and noble who was well acquainted with the Algonquin, as all Basque were. This is why they ended up in the Basque port town of Tadoussac. In addition to this, they share a language with the Algonquin, which is likely why the Innu men felt comfortable visiting France. Amar de Chast had recently restored the two young Innu men back into their country from visiting in France in 1602, and this wasn't the first of such voyages. It was Algonquin practice to train our princes by immersion in foreign culture and tradition, leading to many of our early sons mastering the French language and culture. This is what we see in the example of a young man known to history as the Petit Canada, known to us from the Journal of Jean Herod, and by contemporaneous historian Pierre Geroy. These early sources catalog over 10 indigenous trips to Europe from Quebec. Any of these young Algonquin princes could have served as translator-navigators. However, in his book Samuel de Champlain's Des Savages, 1st edition 1603, he talks about meeting these two young Innu men who are eager to return to France. During the Grand Tabaget, on May 26th and 27th of 1603, Samuel describes having met and befriending the two young Innu men on the coast of Point awh-it, where the Grand Tabaget took place. Again, their connection to Amar de Chast explains how they would have known to seek Samuel out. Point awh-it is the name of the place today, but in Samuel's time it was being referred to as the coast of St. Matthew. This is likely due to the fact that their ship was due to depart on the patron saint day of St. Matthew on September 21st of that year. At that time, it was customary for Christians to give pagans Christian names. Though history currently views Tadoussac as a French port, the French in Champlain's time viewed Tadoussac as a Basque Portuguese port. They thought of the Algonquin, Basque, and Portuguese as more or less interchangeable. Thus, the two Innu men that Samuel de Champlain met on St. Matthew's coast, or in Portuguese, Mathieu Da Costa, were likely sired with this name on their journey back to France, since they were thought to be an extension of the Portuguese Empire from the point of view of Champlain. While today the name of the actual coast has been changed, the region remembers the association between Tadoussac and Mathieu Da Costa, with over 40 lakes, parks, rivers, mountains, and regional schools and businesses, all carrying this historical name of Matthew. Thus, it was these two Innu men that were each referred to as Matthew from a coast, one of whom returned to his home continent dying of scurvy, while the other was chased, kidnapped by Dutchmen attempting to make a buck, and whom eventually is last recorded in a La Havre jail cell. Though these accounts don't confirm the Innu identity of Mathieu Da Costa with absolute certainty, they do provide a much stronger case than the fanciful baseless story currently offered. Like the incredibly, and some would say deliberately mysterious misunderstood Olivier Le Jeune, the opaque Mathieu Da Costas continue to be shrouded by obscurity, not because of the color of their skin, but because of its association with indigenous North America. If you appreciated this exploration into Algonquin history and want to promote this kind of content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you are of Loon Heritage, register and be the solution for all our generations. Live life loud, live life Loon. Apology.